This lecture introduces the art of Pacific cultures, specifically Australia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, those cultures that Europeans encountered when exploring in the 18th and 19th centuries. Europeans divide Oceania or the tropics into these various cultural and geographic areas: Australia, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia that we'll look at next time. Here we have them divided over the great expanse of the Pacific Ocean, with Australia to the far west and then Polynesia to the far east. Australia is going to encompass both the continent here, the Northern and Southern Territories, and Tasmania, home to the famed Tasmanian devil. Melanesia, known as such because it translates to Black Islands, named for the inhabitants' skin color and complexion that Europeans encountered there, makes up the area of New Guinea and the islands all the way down to Fiji. Micronesia, or the small islands, are made up of North Melanesia, or north of Melanesia. So these tiny islands are much smaller and spread out in a much greater expanse than is Papua New Guinea and that region to the south. Polynesia, or the area of many islands, is the triangle that is formed by way of New Zealand, Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and Hawaii in the far north. So this is going to be the area closest to the continental United States. The last to be populated of these regions is Polynesia, and it encompasses 7.7 million square miles, and fewer than 130,000 miles of those are actually dry land. The diversity of flora and fauna of plants and animals greatly decreases as one travels from west to east, because the different types of animals and plants were brought by settlers who were colonizing these islands thousands of years ago. So it is what you can actually carry on a boat, whether that be pigs, dogs, chickens, different types of yams and plants, etc. The experiences that these various peoples had with Europeans varied widely. For in New Zealand, for instance, the Treaty of Waitangi of 1840 recognized the Maori land rights and, as the Maori themselves, to have the same rights as British subjects. This is obviously not the case across the board as in Australia. For Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea were once a single continent, who during the Ice Age would have been settled between 25,000 BCE from settlers traveling from Southeast Asia. The Lapita culture is an Austronesian set of speakers that traveled from Taiwan around 4000 BCE. Theirs is among the earliest artifacts to survive on the Australian mainland. They were farmers who were going to grow taro and yams, as well as fishermen. They brought with them from the Asian continent dogs, pigs, and chickens, and they had a very distinctive ceramic style. The fragments of a large Lapita jar here from around 1200 to 1100 BCE is going to be approximately 1¼ inch tall, a small section of this jar, and it was created through incised stamp-like patterns of dots, lines, and hatching. In case it is not easily decipherable, we're looking at a face here, much like those of the later Middle Ages and the medallion of the bust of Christ, whereby the nose, the eyes, the almond shape, and then the ovoid shape of the head surround it in the same way. This is one of the earliest examples of a human face in all of history. In 1788, we find Captain James Cook is in Australia and declares the continent terra nullius, or nobody's land, a legal term that was used by European settlers and colonizers to lay claim to areas that did not have a civilization. So claiming this area for Britain, he overlooked the fact that, or ignored it, we should say, that there were 300,000 indigenous Australians already there who had arrived 50,000 years earlier and spoke nearly 250 languages. This makes them the oldest continuous culture in the world, with 40,000 years of continuous rock art. As in America, as soon as Europeans arrived, the diseases they carried, like smallpox, killed 50% of the native populations. Those more at risk were children and the elderly. The indigenous styles of painting in Australia to this day are divided by way of geography, for you have in the north the Arnhem Land, or the Northern Territory, and in the south the Central Desert. These very distinct and vastly different climates are going to give rise to different cultures of the native Australian population and the styles they produce. The Virunga Statement, this one produced by various Indigenous Australian artists in 1988, it was presented by these Indigenous Australians to then Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and it was a call for Aboriginal rights and a return of their land and citizenship to them, for they were the original inhabitants of this continent. The area above, as seen here with this crocodile, is going to show the Arnhem Land style, which uses natural ochre colors and cross-hatching, or rerk, as it is known, with zigzag patterns taken from rock art. So here we have the actual rock art and famous example that inspired this section above. So here is another section of this type of jagged, almost skeletal-like approach to rock art in showing different fish. The other side is going to be taken from the style influenced by the culture to the south in the Central Desert, which uses fluid and curved lines with dots surrounding them. This is going to be a continued interest that survived from the Lapita culture much earlier on that also utilized a series of curvilinear dots as contours. In 1992, land was in fact granted to Indigenous Australians, but no treaty followed regarding their citizenship, rights, and/or what would happen based on the fact that the British took their land from them. These issues remain unresolved, as are those in multiple cases in the United States with tribes who sue the American government for their land back as well. Central to understanding the belief system of these native Australians is the notion of dream time, or dreaming, which is the chronological period before humans existed. It was at this time that the world began as a featureless place, and ancestral spirit beings emerged from this formlessness and crossed the continent, creating the various features, from mountains to forests to oceans. They created animals, plants, and humans, and through ceremonies of these aboriginals, they are needed to ensure the remembrance of these past creative efforts by the spirit beings. The system that emerges from the series of remembrance are known as Aboriginal laws. The Aborigines believed that they were descended from these spirit beings, such as the Northwest natives, who became features of the earth and thus sacred sites. So the ancestral spirits become a rock or a mountain that is considered sacred to the Aborigines. This is going to be very similar to the Pacific Northwest, where we discussed the notion that these tribes believed they could trace their lineage and ancestry back to an original spiritual animal. The dreaming stories that are considered sacred and secret and are not shared openly with outsiders have multiple levels of meaning and require learning over a lifetime, where more and more is revealed to initiates as they grow older and only to men. The dreaming, it's important to understand, never ceased, and so the spirit beings still exist and are among us, and they honor them through their ceremonial art forms like rock art, bark, sand paintings, ground sculptures, songs, and dances that all renew the powers of their ancestors. The meetings that are so famous of the Aborigines, where these dances and performances occur, are called corrobores. These corrobores are meant to imitate the dances and the ceremonies that are also carried out by these spirits, like the corrobore of Mimi, or the spirit of the rocks here, painted by Jimmy Midjaw. In it, we find that Mimi, or spirits who live in the spaces between rocks, come out at night. They supposedly, according to Aboriginal tradition, taught humans how to hunt and cook animals, how to dance and sing and play instruments, all necessary for the process of the dreaming and the corrobores in order to remember the ancestral spirits and to get closer to them. The forms here are going to be tall, thin, human-like figures that are all in motion, almost as though they're holding pom-poms and playing music. They emerge from rock shelters and are painted on rock shelters. Now, changing from rock art, they are in the 20th century going to be painted on eucalyptus bark, especially in northern Australia. Here we have another example of the type of mimes, or the spirits that are so popular in this area. Turning from Australia to Melanesia, or the Black Islands, we have a very different culture, and one that is going to be organized not around the dreaming or corrobores, but instead of a male-dominated society or patriarchal society that will value the accumulation of wealth and power. And now this society is spread out from New Guinea to the islands of Fiji and will vary based on what area we are discussing and the topography and food source. Here at Papua New Guinea, we're going to find the largest of the Pacific Islands, where in the eastern section we have Papua New Guinea proper, and in the western section, Papua of the West, or Indonesia. Now this is an area or island near the equator with mountains that are 16,000 feet tall, also with rainforests, marshes, grasslands, and so we have a variety of environments and cultures that develop here. The permanent settlements that develop are going to be organized around agriculture. Social position in these settlements would be achieved through the accumulation of wealth, such as through the number of pigs one would own, leadership positions, as well as those in men's societies. Ritual spaces in these settlements in Papua New Guinea are going to house ceremonies to initiate people to different levels, that being male initiates, we should add. They facilitate relationships with the deceased and help control and/or satiate supernatural forces. Here in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia, we have art forms that are primarily ephemeral, where poison, scarification, tattooing, and body decoration are the most prevalent form of art. Men would then, after tattooing or scarification is performed, would perform in front of the women who would be the audience here. They live in clans of extended families, where wealth again is going to be taken from the totality and the accumulation of swine or pigs, and status in a society and this village from a yam cult. And annually we have the Long Yam Festival, illustrating the significance of this yam cult. Yams were considered to represent and to connect to this clan's ancestors. Thus, the potency of the growers can be seen in the size and length of the yam. Hence, once again, we can also relate this to one's virility and masculinity and how many children one has. The ritual exchange of the finest yams accompanies and is part of the Long Yam Festival, and literally where men measure their yams against one another. Here we have an example of the great length that these yams can grow, and thus the longer and larger, the more power and the more prestige a man would have. A hamlet or village here in Melanesia is going to be where we have sleeping, cooking, and storehouses for yams, as well as ritual spaces, the most sacred of which is the spirit house or the Karambo. So these are small villages with maybe a dozen structures in these isolated areas in the forest. The Karambos are only for men, and they hold, along with Yam cult objects, those for clan identity. They are all hidden from women and boys, and the ceremonies associated with the Karambo and these cult activities only take place in early morning before young boys and women wake up. This is only when men are awake and active. Men will then organize these rituals and initiation rites as young boys grow up. They conduct community business within these, and a hamlet's prestige can be directly equated to the quality and the size of one's karambo and yams. And so we find that all of those tribes and or villages in the region would compete to make bigger and bigger sacred shrines like this karambo seen here. The notion of storing yams in here that are also associated with the clan's ancestors are not surprising. Now, the Karambo is made with a frame of poles, a triangular floor plan as seen here from the side, and roofed with split cane and thatch. The facade, seen from the front, which is painted, is going to have a woven mat at the bottom, a wooden lintel painted with, again, bark panels and the faces of spirits seen at the lower level. Then at the top we have the flying witch motif, which is the female element in this ensemble, and you could also understand this as a vaginal shape. And then we have the penis of the house above, of course, reinforcing the notion that this is going to be a patriarchal society and is a male-dominated ritualistic space. The door, as you see here in the lower right-hand side, or entrance to this karambo, is supposedly referencing a vaginal shape and the womb. For entering and exiting this structure is the same as dying and being reborn. The paint is also thought to have magical qualities, therefore it is ritualistically repainted periodically and represent the ancestors and the spirits of the tribe. This is the same understanding that we discussed as the Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest who traced their lineage back to sacred spirit animals and would emerge out of this symbolic vagina to be born again, tying themselves more directly to these ancestral spirits. Turning to the adornment of women, we have bilim, which are the most recognizable cloth and features of women in Papua New Guinea. Now, the women shown here characteristically are carrying them on their heads, slinging them over their backs, and they are used for a variety of purposes, not just carrying goods in the public arena. The bilim, or netted bags, are looped from a single long thread and are the country's national symbol, just as Dutch wax fabric would be the symbol of African women, this brightly colored fabric. Here, bilim is meant to symbolize, like jars in ancient Greece, the womb of a woman and symbolizes brides. For just as men are carried in the womb of a woman early on, so too he will be buried in this. The bones of men are buried in it, and widows wear a man's bag in mourning for a period of time. These are also exchanged as gifts and used to carry children. Turning to the southwest coast, we have a very different tribe and economy and political structure for the Asmat, a tribe that were, until the 1970s, warriors and headhunters. They believed that trees and the fruit that grows on trees were the equivalent of human heads. Therefore, animals like birds that eat fruit from trees and praying mantises that also remove the heads of their lovers were their ancestral animals and or equated to headhunters. In this culture, we find they believe that death was always caused by an enemy, either directly by way of killing and or through ritualistic magic. This required revenge to be taken on the part of his family and his tribe, so he would then be avenged by taking the enemy's head who was believed to cause his death to appease the spirit of the deceased. This maintained balance between the tribes in a quid pro quo or tit-for-tat arrangement. As one person died, even if for natural causes, they would then take the head of and skull as a trophy from a neighboring tribe. The Asmat ancestral spirit poles, or bish seen here, are going to relate the same function as the mortuary totem poles in the Pacific Northwest. For the spirit of the deceased would remain in a village, and so in order to ensure they cross over to the next world, they would erect memorial poles that would embody the spirit of the ancestors, paying tribute to them and also helping the newly dead find their way to the next life. The notion of showing the men stacked one on top of another is very similar in structure and function and symbolism to the totem we discussed in the Pacific Northwest. In order to make these, a tree would be felled symbolically as though they're attacking an enemy. So men in this society would grab axes and then go out and attack as though it were a tree, and then carve the figures of the deceased and the dead who were to be avenged on it. The bent pose of the men here is meant to relate to a praying mantis, as we find the phallic design of the roots coming out look like the mandibles and the arms of the mantis. The carving and the feast is going to involve the relatives who very publicly state that they will avenge the dead through this head-hunting raid, where men will go through and prepare in mock battles and women cheer them on. The lacy phallus or roots relate to male fertility and often, as in this example, have tiny humanoid figures in them showing the ancestry of the male line. This also relates to the type of decoration we would have on bodies, as though body ornament being painted or tattooed. Here is a detail of the work as we see these interlocking figures, much as the stacked totem we talked about earlier. These would face the river and ensure that the dead could travel to the realm of the ancestors beyond the sea, thus crossing over a body of water like the Vikings, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans in the West is understood as transitioning from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, as the Vikings are going to ensure that a ship takes a person to Valhalla, and we pay the ferryman in the Greco-Roman tradition to take you across the river Styx. So too do these poles serve as a canoe to take the spirit downriver, away from the village, in order to appease it, as they have already carried out this ritualistic hunt to get the head of their enemy. New Ireland is the eastern island and part of Papua New Guinea seen here. We have a different tribe and a different set of practices within the culture that are unique to this region. The Malangan and or those that commemorate the death with these rites held by clan leaders for a wife's deceased family members is going to be a very interesting tribe that carries out, like sand painters of the Southwest in the Americas, an ephemeral approach to rituals that are meant to be destroyed once the ritual is concluded. The Malangan will take months of training in seclusion once a member of the wife's family has passed in order to prepare very elaborate and intricate dances and then present them to the public and tribe at large. It is at this time that they are going to be given carved and painted figures representing the ancestors, right, of this area. The combined ceremonies of the feasts, the mass dances, are meant to also correspond with the creation of a special house to display sculptures of those that honor the dead and represent them. Here we have the Malangan display in Medina Village in New Ireland, Papua New Guinea from around 1930. This is a very interesting example as we're honoring 12 deceased members of a wife's family. This would have been kept secret, this tableau, until the unveiling at the climax of the festivities, representing the various spirits and the various ancestors. After the ceremony, interestingly, these would be destroyed, for they were no longer ritually active, and so their power is going to dissipate, and we cannot allow the ritualistic spiritual energies to maintain and stay around the village. As in all cultures, the dead need to be paid respect to and transition to the next life successfully. Also part of New Guinea, we have New Britain, just to the southwest of New Ireland. Here we have another culture. The Tolai people here, in part of a male secret society, create tabooan masks that are used for a very specific purpose in these ritualistic dances. Here we have different levels of knowledge associated with the dances performed that are effective for both spiritual and social control. For instance, men will call upon spirits that are represented by the masks to settle disputes, stop fights, or force debt payment. Therefore, the spiritual world is called upon to affect the physical one. Here we have masks that represent both male and female spirits. However, all dances are performed by men, much like Shakespearean plays. In this example, we have a duk-duk mask worn by new initiates who return to the village from the bush and are going to have undergone preparation to enter society. And so we find that this notion of a ceremony relating to initiation of young men who come out of the primitive wild into civilization is common across the globe. The leaf skirt seen here is considered sacred, and we have painted bark cloth and the feathers. So the dance is going to be one that brings and calls upon the spiritual figure represented to affect the village. Finally, Micronesia, or the Small Islands, is just north of Melanesia. The two regions we will look at today will be that of the Marshall Islands and Pompeii. The majority of these small islands are actually low-lying coral atolls or coral reefs surrounded by lagoons. Therefore, there are very limited materials, and the western region is primarily volcanic. The textiles used in the arts of these peoples are primarily from banana and coconut fibers. Human figures are often carved of wood, but survive rarely and are quite scarce. Tattooing and performative arts are actually the most abundant in this region. Now, the Micronesians are excellent sailors and have navigational skills and are going to produce very precise sailing canoes that not only are able to traverse shallow waters, but the great expanses of the Pacific Ocean. The Marshall Islands, in fact, are going to be home to sailors that use celestial navigation and would teach the younger generation using a new type of art form. Here we have an example of the size and shape of the canoes, which allow them to connect with the various tribes in islands thousands of miles apart. Here we have one of these instructional tools, or a stick chart, called wapepe or matang. These are going to be maps of land and the paths between the islands, and are going to be made of sticks and coconut fibers and shells. A very ingenious way to communicate to others how to traverse these vast distances and not get lost and die at sea. The schematic diagrams are actually of the prevailing ocean currents and the wave patterns between the islands. So just as we would map the ocean currents and what direction they flow, so too did the Micronesians here in the Marshall Islands try to map out for others how they would be pulled and directed by way of said currents and the land masses around them. The currents are going to be the areas that made up of sticks, whereas the shells are going to be the islands that are the land masses. The sticks around the shells are going to be waves that's shaped by the island deflecting the prevailing wind, so that we know an island or landmass is going to be present without actually seeing it, because we see the refracted waves that are going to be crashing around it. This, of course, is an observation that allows these peoples to be excellent navigational sailors and to be great mariners. Now, Sokin's rock at Pompeii in the Federated States of Micronesia, in these basalt cliffs, are going to show us the material that is used for the largest stone architectural complex in all of Oceania. The complex of Non-Modal in Pompeii is roughly 170 acres and is made up of 92 artificial islands within a network of canals, much like Venice today. And like Venice, you would get around this city with these canals based on the tide that comes in and out of the city on water. The complex, as survives today, is made up of tons and tons of stone that was moved here. The seawalls and breakwaters are made up of walls that are 15 feet high and 35 feet thick. They protect this area and precinct from both invaders and the natural elements, and once again, the waves that would crest against this civilization. The openings in the breakwaters provide access to the ocean and the tides to come into the city and flush out the canals of any various human waste products and or anything that would need to be removed, such as the remnants of cleaning animals, fish, and or the byproducts of cooking processes and cleaning processes. All would then naturally be flushed back out to sea. Kings of this area controlled a labor force of 1,000 people. Thus, we find masonry is used here in alternating layers of log-shaped stones and boulders of basalt, the cornerstones of which seen here are 50 tons each. To give you an idea of their scale, here we have a man standing next to them. The idea that the civilization could loosen them from the basalt cliffs and move them here section by section is quite astounding. They were split from the cliffs when the stone is heated and then doused with water. This weakened them and they would crack. We know now the same process would have been used by the ancient Egyptians to loosen very large multi-ton stones from the quarries to create massive hieroglyphic monuments to these boulders for pyramids. The royal mortuary compound at Non-Modal here rises 25 feet high and increases by the number of header courses as we move up to the final sanctuary, which is rectangular. Here we have the main entrance to the final interior sanctuary where you would have had the king. Progressively moving higher and higher with rectangles within rectangles, we have the king's mortuary compound and the sarcophagi of where the royalty would have been buried. The outer walls are going to provide steps to the interior walls, central courtyard, and cubicle tomb, all of which are going to be made without the use of pulleys, cranes, or any other moving mechanical devices. Therefore, in summation, the arts of Oceania are restricted due to their materials and location, so they need to adopt other materials. They would use, again, these reinforcing social contracts, mores and expectations, and hegemony, and that's what art primarily does in these regions, with many of it being ephemeral and transient, that being they are meant to be performed, and many of these works are going to be destroyed thereafter because their ritualistic purpose has been completed and fulfilled. Next time we will continue on with Polynesia and the rest of Oceania.